it is quite difficult to be absolutely sure. But the reason that it's difficult to tease apart with the benefit of the data we have subsequently is because so many things happen simultaneously, both directly as a result of government decisions. So the decisions that were taken on the 16th by the Prime Minister and announced by the Prime Minister, the decisions on schooling, and the lockdown happened in extremely short period of time. And then, of course, people were changing their own behaviours in response to the threat they saw, not to do with the way in which government was telling them to do things, but because they were using their own common sense about things they would do. If you put all of those together, they were all happening over the same very short period, and trying to pull apart, therefore, the individual components of this is really very difficult. Had we been in a situation where the decisions on the 16th, the school closures and lockdown were, let's say, 3 or 4 weeks apart, it would have been a lot easier at least to say what is the impact of schooling alone. It might or might not have been possible to have said something about the impact of the indirect versus the direct.
Thank you. I'm going to move on then, if I may, to ask you a bit about the impacts on children during that first period of school closures. I think it's right, isn't it, that prior to the pandemic, there were already some studies which had been done based on a number of other pandemics or outbreaks of illness like equine flu that enabled scientists to understand something about the psychological impacts of quarantine. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And specifically, there was some work or some research which had been done which demonstrated that quarantining children could have psychological effects on them as well.
Yes, I mean, in a sense, this is a statement of the obvious, but I think it still is worth saying that there's extraordinarily strong evidence that being in school, as just being in school, is very good for children, developmentally, educationally, in terms of mental health, arguably in terms of physical health data, and that's a bit less clear. And it's pretty obvious that having children isolated is not a natural situation and is not good for children. And in a sense, the scientific evidence all supports what common sense would tell people, yes. But it's all in a line, which is these are things you would not wish to do to children except under the most extreme circumstances. Unfortunately, we were in the most extreme circumstances. And I'll go back to probably almost my opening kind of comments about Module 2, which was all the decisions we had were very, very bad, and it was some of them were a bit worse and some of them were a lot worse. But these were bad choices to have to make.
And is it your position, Professor Whitty, it didn't take scientists to tell decision makers or policy makers that closing schools to most children or lockdown would cause these kind of psychological consequences that the studies suggested they would have? Yes,
I mean, I don't think there was anybody who I heard talking about this who wasn't absolutely confident, with or without scientific advice, that closing schools is a very bad thing for children and should be avoided at all costs. And I've read the witness statements of many of the political leaders, and they make that point, and that was their view. The science, in a sense, supported their view, but their view was the common sense view that I think every parent and every citizen probably would have.
I'm sure that that's correct. I think I'm asking you about something slightly different, which is the evidence that it wasn't school closure, it was quarantine, could have quite distinct psychological impacts.
Yes,
not just on children, I think on adults too, but there was specific learning.
Absolutely, and I think isolating people is bad at all stages of life. During periods of development, the implications are likely to be worse, and that's what the scientific evidence would certainly support.
So can I ask you then, just turning to the role of SAGE during this period, did SAGE have a role in monitoring the sorts of impacts that school closures were having on children and providing advice to government, or was that outside SAGE's role?
The important thing to remember is that SAGE is a scientific body and its job was to look at scientific data. It didn't have any data collecting capacity of its own at all, and that wasn't its job, and indeed I don't think it would probably have been particularly good at it because that wasn't what it was set up for. It was the wrong people. So where evidence came out of scientific studies based on data collected by others, SAGE was in a strong position to help policy leaders, policymakers interpret that, and in particular to look at the strength of scientific assertions that were made in papers and in some other, and in what's called the grey literature, so unpublished studies. So it was able to do that, but what it wasn't able to do and wasn't expected to do was actually do the monitoring. That was very much done by organisations like DFE in the case of Education Public Health England, as it then was in the case of the public health interventions, NHS for the NHS interventions.
Can we maybe look at that distinction in terms of the advice that was given, and maybe look at INQ 00007 4924. So this is advice that's coming much later about the role of children in transmission. We can see this is the 16th of April 2020, so very much in the thick, as it were, of the first period of school closures. And if we look at 2, it says there's a consensus that evidence on the role of children in transmission of COVID-19 is unclear, with a number of gaps in understanding. And then it sets out a number of bullet points around that. So, for example, that there is limited information on the behaviour and contact patterns of children. And then at the final bullet, it sets out there's a lack of information on current experiences for children and parents. For example, in terms of variation in the extent and quality of home distance learning, attendance by vulnerable children, and changes on child protection safeguarding services, impact on parental mental health, etc., and an evidence gap around longer-term impacts for children, particularly around mental health and child development. Just looking at that, Professor Whitty, I think the first question is why that sort of advice, or why that is being incorporated, as it were, into SAGE's advice at this point. And I think the second point is, I think we know that there was evidence and information available from around this point about some of the impacts that arose, or that were certainly becoming patent at this point. So it's really just trying to understand SAGE's role and whether there's an issue here as to the sorts of evidence and information that was becoming available at this point being passed on, as it were, to SAGE.
Firstly, this is an example, and there were others in other areas, where we were moving at unbelievable speed almost every day, big changes in the data that was coming in up to and including the lockdown period. Once we were in that, we were able to write out in much longer form some of the discussions that were being had verbally in SAGE prior to that, in which we'd only communicated, and also set up subgroups. And the subgroup on children, which was chaired by the chief scientist from the Department for Education, Osman Rahman, at that time, what they were able to do is say, this is the state of knowledge. What they're saying here is not that there was no effect. What they're saying is that against normal scientific criteria, the data are not strong enough for us to be able to say, here is a review we can point to, here's a systematic review, here's a big trial, that can make these points really solid. We need to now test these and try and find information out about them. And we were aware, of course, that these questions were not just being asked in the UK, they were being asked all around the world. But I think if you'd asked scientists from around the world, remembering that science is an international discipline, was this a fair summary of what was known at this point? I don't think anyone would have said, no, that's not a fair summary of the gaps, and these gaps therefore needed to be filled. But in policy, you can't, the fact there's a gap in evidence in an emergency doesn't, you can't wait until that gap is filled. You have to make decisions and try and fill the gap and then adjust your course subsequently. And of course, we saw that multiple times during COVID.
So I think if we just took, for example, by this stage, it was clear that vulnerable children were attending school in very low numbers on the basis of the Department for Education's own data. So I suppose the question is, if would that sort of information, or that being confirmed, was that going to change advice that was being given at this stage? If these were gaps that were being identified that were capable of being filled?
Well, I mean, whatever SAGE had said on this, and I think this is SAGE doing its job, which is not overstating things because it doesn't have scientific evidence, there was already a policy decision to ensure that vulnerable children could be in school,
yes.
and already a strong policy intent by DFE and social services and others to make sure that did happen. So the decision of whether or not to try and ensure that that was available and indeed made as easy as possible for children who are vulnerable was irrespective of this. This was a scientific point. The policy was going on regardless, and rightly going on regardless. That had already been decided.
All right. I mean, the reason I'm asking about this, and perhaps we can go on to look at this, is that social distancing, I think, was being reviewed at this stage. I know that we're probably coming up to a break. I think we've got 5 minutes. I think we can make some progress in that 5 minutes. But if we look, please, at INQ 000109 please. So this is the social distancing review of the 14th of April. So, I mean, it would seem that that kind of information and understanding the sorts of real-life impacts that the pandemic was having on children might be important and relevant at this point.
Yes, but again, remembering that a scientific advisory body should not go beyond the science. So its job is not to say, well, common sense would tell you. Its job is simply to go on the data that is currently available, which is considered to be strong enough to be able to say that.
Yes.
That's what policymakers rely on it to do.
Yes, and I think that we're coming to the issue really that's at stake here, which is where do those various bits of information feed into the decision making. If we just look at this social distancing review of the 14th of the 14th of April, and for example, I'm just picking this up, if we look at page 11, and paragraph 20, for example. So I think at this stage, relaxing restrictions on the use of outdoor spaces was being contemplated and allowing adults, I think, more freedom to go outside. Is that right?
Well, I think the idea was to make it possible to be more freedom to go outside in general.
Yes.
And I think it is possibly worth reflecting at this point that the restrictions on outdoor activities were much stronger in many other countries, for example, France, than they were in the UK. So we were, in fact, at the more liberal end amongst many of our peers. But I think there was quite a strong view among SAGE that outdoors was a lot safer than indoors already by this point, and that only strengthened as time went by, as the evidence came in.
And I think we see at the end of this, I won't read out the whole paragraph. It says it's important to note that such a relaxation should not cover shared hard surfaces such as children's playgrounds without nerve tag agreement.
I think the key word there is shared. It was the sharing, not the hard surface, that matters here. And it was really to ensure that people had thought through the implications of contact sports and a variety of other things at this point in the pandemic, when we were still at a very perilous point.
Thank you. That can come down. I mean, one of the issues, and that the inquiry has heard Module 8 has heard quite a lot of evidence about, is how the pandemic restricted children's ability to play. And it might seem surprising, given what was known, certainly by the 14th of April, that whilst a potentially more relaxed approach might be taken to adults' ability to go outside, that isn't being reflected in the advice that's being given about children's playgrounds, for example.
I think that's a slightly misleading way of putting it, because it implies that there was more restrictions on children than adults, which is not correct. The difficulty is that a lot of child's play, particularly in, for example, schoolyards, tends to be quite physical and tends to be quite physically close. And outdoors makes a big difference if you're talking about more than 2 meters apart for aerosol transmission, which has come up multiple times in the inquiry, so I'm not going to go into that in any detail. If you've got someone who's 2 inches apart from someone else, it doesn't matter whether it's indoors or outdoors, if they shout or sing or bellow or cough over them, that's ballistic, and that is not going to be, that you're going to get a transmission. And the key point on this, and I cannot stress this too much, is it's about households transmitting to other households. So if it was children playing within their own family, in due course within a bubble, variety of other things, that was not going to increase the risk. If you've got 12 different children from 12 different households all in a scrum together, then the potential for transmitting between households is going to be there. And so that was really the issue. And expecting children, particularly young children, to maintain the kind of strict social distancing that was relatively straightforward for adults has a certain, you have to have a certain reality about this. But there was no intention to disadvantage children, quite the reverse.
I think just going back to that bit of advice and about the hard surfaces, the inquiry understands, but this may be wrong, that was part of the reason why school playgrounds were not reopened until, I think it was the July of 2020, and then it was a matter for individual local authorities to risk assess the position. Is that correct?
That is correct. I mean, I think if we were running things again, this is one of the areas where I think I would have preferred a policy that was more liberal about children's play in reality, but that is a policy view which is not really my job. At this point we didn't have scientific evidence to help us particularly, except for the point I've just made, which is when you're very close to someone, it doesn't really matter whether you're indoors or outdoors. Ballistic transmission or touch transmission is going to occur at just the same rate.
I understand the point you make, Professor Whitty, about it's a policy position on play, but given that you were in a position of being able to offer epidemiological advice and can reflect an epidemiological perspective to Module 8, that sounds as though the imperative for restricting children's play may not have been sufficiently strong to warrant the kind of restrictions that were placed on children's play.
Well, if I can go back to some repeated evidence that was given early on in February, March, repeated up to this point in April, one of the things that we said was there is no, I'm going to paraphrase a bit, but there's no point in closing schools if what we then do is recreate all the situations that lead to schools having children meeting together, and indeed their parents meeting together. They're just the schools are closed. There's nothing gained by that. So I think it was important in considering this, and I think policymakers were right to do this, that in the decisions that were taken, they didn't recreate the environment of schools, but without a school. That would have essentially defeated the huge sacrifice of having the schools closed in the first place.
But would it have been possible to take a more nuanced approach and perhaps say to parents, you can let your children, they can go outside and mix, but you parents mustn't congregate, for example, you must stay separate. I'm trying to explore what it is you think could have, what could have been relaxed in respect of children's play?
There is, well, at this point in the pandemic, and I think nothing overturned this actually, there was no evidence that children could not transmit to one another. So it's not magically that if you can just leave the adults out of it, the children can play happily together and nothing will happen. That isn't a reality in terms of the epidemiology of this. The difficulty was how to make it possible for children to play in a context where they were not going to recreate the situations you'd have in school or bring households together and therefore lead to transmission of infection in a way that otherwise would not have happened. And I think it's important that we don't get ourselves into a situation where we imply that there was a lovely outcome that could make play easy and it wouldn't have a negative epidemiological impact. It would do. I certainly think we could probably have done this in a more subtle way, and there might have been ways we could have done it which would have been better. But at this point in the pandemic, remembering in mid-April, we are still talking about an extraordinary impact on health, very large numbers of people dying, very large effects on the NHS. I think we had to be rational in the way we were doing this. And the policymakers were doing their best in the decisions they were taken to give children as much flexibility as possible, as well as adults outside, but without leading to a recreation of bringing households together. And that was really the tension. Yeah. Of course, everybody wants children to play, just as everyone wants children to go to school, and everyone wants people not to die of COVID. Unfortunately, those policy aims were essentially in some degree of tension.
And just in understanding all of that and the fears that existed at that time, in terms of the more subtle approach that could have been taken or could have been taken later on to play, practically speaking, what might that have looked like?
I think as we became increasingly confident that the outdoor environment was safer than the indoor environment, which we thought was probable, but the data for it was much less clear in April than it was later. I think probably it would have been possible to take, well, certainly, for example, increase the amount of time people could spend outside, and time outside was not in itself a risk. The thing which I'm repeating myself, but I'm repeating myself because I don't want this to come out as a recommendation of the inquiry and then cause problems in future pandemics. What we did, doing that at the expense of recreating chains of transmission between families, would undermine the effects of closing schools, which in themselves is a very bad thing for the development of children. So play is not the only thing. I'm completely sympathetic to the view that play is incredibly important to children, but the problem is that we had policy aims that were in tension.
So is the issue really about, and when I say messaging, it's also about people obviously complying with messaging as well, but there might have been more capacity for children to be outside and to play, but as long as it was within quite strict parameters and didn't involve the mixing of households.
Yes, and that in a sense, I think, is what that last document you showed me is hinting at, which is there is an environment where generally children tend to be very close together and in contact sports and so on. And then there are other environments, and the ones that we were concerned about were those sorts of environments that would recreate the effect of a school, but whilst the school was closed. And I wasn't involved in the policy decisions on this, but I'm just trying to explain the kind of logic behind it.
My lady, is that a convenient?
Just before we break, you said, Professor Whitty, if running again, I would have perhaps had a more liberal policy. Is that with the considerable benefit of hindsight?
No, I think the bit of the restrictions which at the time I thought we should have been more liberal, if I'm honest, was the amount of time that people could spend outside. I think I couldn't see the logic of that from an infection control point of view, to be honest. I think it almost happened by accident, and that I think probably is something we should have looked at, and for children in particular, I think that's very important. It's important for everyone.
Thank you very much. As you remember, we take regular breaks. I shall return at 12:05. All rise.
Name, please.
Christopher Whitty.
Professor Whitty, I think you ought to have before you two witness statements which will come up. I think the first bears the number INQ 000588046. Yes.
I'm just waiting for that now. Thank you.
And are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I am.
And you ought to then have a second witness statement in Module 8, which is in fact your 10th witness statement in this inquiry, INQ 0005888220. Yes?
Yes.
And are you content that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I am.
Thank you. Professor Whitty, I was going to begin your evidence at the start of the chronology, if I may, and ask you some questions about the outset of the pandemic. And specifically, if you can explain why SAGE first contemplated the closure of schools on the 4th of February 2020.
Thank you. So, in the pandemic, and based on the information we initially had from colleagues in China and then subsequently from other countries, notably Italy, we were confident that this was a respiratory pandemic, or at least a respiratory epidemic that had a potential to turn into a pandemic at the earliest stages. Secondly, we had reasonable evidence, not convincing evidence overwhelmingly, but reasonable evidence that children were relatively unaffected in terms of severity. We didn't have any evidence really that was convincing on whether there was any reduction in transmission, and we thought there was a possibility that it was transmitting quite extensively through children, but with no or very few symptoms, so that was a possibility. In the context of respiratory epidemics and pandemics, and the best evidence for this is from influenza, which is a very different pandemic in some ways, but has some similarities, particularly the route of transmission. We know that the closure of schools has been associated with reductions of transmission, significant reductions of transmission in the case of influenza. And the reason for that is that children tend to mix together quite a lot. And in the case of influenza, and this was an important difference which we recognised from the beginning, because there's often some residual cross-reactivity from previous flu pandemics, there's often a disproportionate amount of transmission in influenza in children during a number of other technical differences between the early evidence, but our view was that from an early stage, the closure of schools is one of the tools that has been used in previous pandemics effectively, and therefore had to be considered in this one.
I think I'm probably going to preempt something that you might be asked in a moment, which is maybe just if you could slow down slightly.
I apologise.
And maybe it would help then to look at the influenza strategy to understand the background to this. And we have that at INQ 0000222708. And I think if we look at page 39 of that, please. And paragraph 4.23. That sets out in that first paragraph that there were benefits in the context of an influenza pandemic of school closures. Is that right?
That is correct.
And it sets out that in order to be effective, that such closures would need to be prolonged. Is that also?
That is also correct. It differentiates between closures of individual schools for outbreaks and what it calls mass closures across a large area to try and control the epidemic. But in the second context, they would have to be prolonged to have their effect, and even more prolonged in the case of COVID.
That's what I was just going to ask you, looking at paragraph 4.24. I think where it says, under some circumstances, head teachers and their board of governors may take the decision to close individual establishments. That's reflecting that the potential closure of individual schools within a pandemic. Is that right?
That is right. I think important to highlight, because the differences and similarities between influenza and COVID are quite important in these early weeks as we were trying to work out what to do, that in contrast to COVID, in influenza, a lot of the risk is to children. So therefore, there is a logic to closing individual schools which have an outbreak for the protection of children in a way that is less true, was less true for COVID, as far as we could see at this point. I also should say, in, I think, module 1 or 2, we discussed this document and did make the point that actually, in our view, this was written by people who'd just been through a very mild pandemic, and I think there are a number of weaknesses in this document as a whole, so I don't want to say this was our playbook, yes. But certainly schools were considered from really quite early on.
And just looking over the page, if we can, I can see it's there. it sets out, once the virus is more established in the country, the general policy would be that schools should not close unless there were local continuity reasons or particularly vulnerable children. This policy will be reviewed in light of information about how the pandemic is unfolding at the time. So again, one presumes in relation to flu, that point that once there has been a mass outbreak of flu, school closures become less important. Is that essentially what this guidance is saying?
Yes, and this is the bit which I think I would actually question, and that's because, and this goes back to the point I've just made, the people writing this had just been through a flu pandemic which actually had lower mortality than a seasonal flu in an average year. If we'd had a flu pandemic like the 1918-19 one, or even the ones we had in the 1950s, 1957 and the 60s, 1968, I don't actually think this necessarily would have been true, because at that point we'd have had quite significant mortality among children, and I think that would not have been good advice. So I think this really reflected the time it was written and the experiences of the people who wrote it.
I'm grateful. I'm just looking at paragraph 4.25. It goes on to set out that the impact of the closure of schools in similar settings on all sectors would have substantial economic and social consequences and disproportionately large effects on health and social care. And presumably that's just reflecting that if you close schools, many parents won't be able to work and may not be able to work in the health sector. Is that right?
That is right. And I think that clearly is true in a sense whenever you close schools.
Yes.
And as we'll probably come on to, the very strong view of both the scientists and public health people like myself and the policymakers was that closing schools had really negative effects for multiple reasons, particularly on children, but also more widely. So nobody wanted to do that except under absolute necessity.
But I think nonetheless at paragraph 4.25 it goes on to recognise that such a step would therefore only be taken in an influenza pandemic with a very high impact. So although school closures cannot be ruled out, it shouldn't be the primary focus of schools planning. So even this plan wasn't saying you can rule out school closures.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And if we look at that policy, is it accurate to summarise it as saying that in the context of a flu pandemic, the general policy is that schools should not close, but in a flu of high impact, a different approach might have to be taken?
That is exactly right, yeah.
Did SAGE ever advise that this guidance on school closures specific to influenza could be read across to COVID-19?
Not specifically. So although there are, and I think it's clear in a sense if you read many of the SAGE minutes, although there's often a comment about using influenza assumptions, those are about numbers of deaths and a number of those kinds of metrics. They weren't about the policies to be used across the two pandemics. But in this particular case, in the case of schooling, certainly it was one of the measures that we would consider in any respiratory infection, but the key word there is consider rather than necessarily do, because everybody doesn't want to do them if we can avoid it.
And can we just maybe look at one of the examples of SAGE advice to see that distinction between applying some of the presumptions around the figures as opposed to the presumption that the policy applied? And that's IN 0106109, and I think we see this as the advice of the 13th of February. And if we go over, please. Yes, thank you. And if I could just ask you before we turn, please, at paragraph 5 of that advice of the 13th of February, it set out that SAGE and wider government should continue to work on the assumption that China will be unable to contain the epidemic. By this stage, how long had that assumption been in effect for?
Well, in practice, and this was explored in quite some detail in Module 2 in particular, but in practice, I think most of the scientific community considered by now this was very unlikely to be contained, not impossible, but very unlikely at this point, and therefore planning should always be on, in a sense, the worst case rather than the hoped-for scenario, and therefore the planning assumption should be it would not be contained, and then if we got a pleasant surprise, fine, but that was looking increasingly unlikely at this point.
And come back and look at that in the context of school closures. But just looking, if we can, please, page 2 at the bottom. It picks up the thread of school closures and it asks, or it sets out that consideration should be given to what the objective was of school closures and sets out that they potentially could delay the first wave of an epidemic or the peak. Is that right?
That's right.
And then it goes on, if we go over the page, please. It sets out at 13, in an influenza pandemic, school children are critical to transmission because they have less immunity and because of their social mixing patterns. But goes on to explain at 14 that the impact of COVID-19 wasn't well understood at this stage. Is that right?
That is correct, but the point on 15 is an important one.
Yes, that's what I was coming to. So yes, setting out that it wasn't known, but that it was known that the serial interval for COVID-19 was longer, yes.
That's correct, and as the other thing which was known at this point was that we would not have any residual immunity in adults, and therefore the differential between adults and children you might see in influenza would be much less likely.
And then looking, yes, so, and I think the critical point then in respect of the serial interval as well was that closures would have to last longer than they might do in an influenza pandemic.
To have the same effect, that's true, yes.
So again, is that an example of the distinction being drawn between the approach or the assumptions that might be correct of influenza but not necessarily correct of COVID-19?
Yes, that's right. And I think with the exception of the severity of the pandemic at a population level, most of these implied that, if anything, it was less likely to be useful in the context of COVID than in influenza.
Thank you. That can come down. Professor Whitty, I wasn't going to take you through all of the advice that was given by SAGE from the 4th of February onwards that relates to school closures. I was just going to ask you about some headlines and to confirm when that advice was given. But if at any stage you want me to take you to that advice, please do. Obviously, we've seen that from the 4th of February onwards, the closure of schools was contemplated, correct?
Yes.
From the 10th of February, it was being advised that the serial interval was longer, the point that we've just made, or we've just seen, meaning that schools would potentially have to be closed for longer if it were to have the same effect. I think from 11th of February, it was advised that the severity of disease in children might be less than that seen in adults.
Yes.
Is that correct? We've seen some of the advice given in respect of the 13th of February. From the 19th of February, it was being advised that larger impacts are seen when closures take place earlier in the pandemic.
That is right in the context of trying to delay a wave. It wouldn't be right necessarily in terms of trying to reduce the size of a peak, and I think that was made at other points along the SAGE sequence.
Just thinking about it in terms of school closures, though, does that distinction necessarily matter at this point?
I think it does matter, because if what we were trying to do, and if you recall that we had the 4 stages: contain, delay, research and mitigate, where, to be clear, those weren't sequential, those could happen in parallel, which is a point which I think sometimes gets missed. But there was no intention at any point in terms of the technical advice from SAGE to suggest that actually we should be closing schools to delay the wave. And the reason for that is that would have required schools to be one of the first things to close, and given all the negative downsides to that for children, for their welfare, and indeed for the wider society and economy, the decision was that that was not a sensible thing to be looking at technically. So the way in which school closures were considered was for the different aim to try and reduce the peak, and for that you don't need to do it at the earliest possible opportunity.
I see. Maybe I'll come back and ask you about that just when we finish this section, if I may, of what the advice was demonstrating. On the 20th of February, and in fact this was seen on the 13th of February as well, there was advice that SPIMO should consider selective school closures and that there should be modelling in respect of that. Do you know if that modelling happened and if there was a separate thread of work, as it were, that was considering selective school closures?
That became much better understood as the pandemic went on, but at this stage the view was we had so little information that being able to do that with any degree of reliability really wasn't possible. So although we were able to make some very broad comments like a small number of people being in school probably didn't significantly reduce the impact of school closures later on, we weren't in a position to be able to give proper scientific advice to policymakers that said what the impacts of different forms of selective closure would be.
So does that mean that at this point in time, so if we're looking at the 13th of February and the 20th of February, that there just wasn't sufficient data to feed into the modelling in order to provide that sort of more granular advice?
Although some of the more self-confident modellers might have felt they were able to, I think the view of SAGE was that we did not have sufficient data and confidence to be able to give information to policymakers they would find useful about differential effects of different models.
And would it have...
different models of school closure, to be clear, rather than different mathematical models.
All right, so in terms of what it was possible to advise on then at around this stage, would it have been a fairly blunt, we can allow a certain number of children potentially, or a certain percentage of the population of school children to attend school? Is it that broad sort of calculation that would have been possible at this point in time?
I mean, at this point, we were probably at the limits of what we could do with any reliability, even just to say total school closure point. We reflect, actually, the difference between primary and secondary children.
All right, so what she goes on to do in this letter is to set out some of the ways in which the rules that had been decided upon were affecting children differently. So I think, first of all, the obvious one about the closure of schools, the second one about the closure of summer sport and play schemes, the third one about the closure of youth clubs and other safe spaces for children, and then the isolation of children for 17 to 14 days upon arrival at a residential children's home. Children in certain settings, so hospitals, youth custody and children homes and foster care, being denied visits with their families. And then the final of these, the confinement of some children within their cells for more than 20 hours a day in some young offenders institutions. Can I ask you perhaps about the last three? Were you aware that some of the advice that had been given was resulting in some of those impacts for children?
I wasn't aware of the last of those in terms of young offender institutions specifically. I mean, just simply because I didn't ask the question, but there are a lot of settings. It's an important point. Until I got the letter, obviously, once I had it, I was then aware of it. The other ones I was aware in principle, but the number of regulations from multiple different bits of the system was very large, and we did actually try and keep an eye open for things where some differentiation could be made. These ones here were ones which were really, back to the previous conversations we've had just before the break, were all about trying to reduce the risks of different family units being brought together in an environment where some form of transmission could occur at this point in the pandemic.
I mean, I think what the Children's Commissioner was getting at, and I'm summarising her letter, and we'll go on to the questions that she asked, was really that these consequences for children were disproportionate to the epidemiological end. So whilst that might have been a legitimate aim, obviously the consequences for children in terms of not being able to see their families in person, and we might be talking about siblings here as opposed to parents, that was too severe an impact on children, and that there needed to be perhaps a bit more nuance. So I'm summarising, but I think that's the point.
And in a sense, I have a lot of sympathy with the overall position she starts from. Narrowly, I was not involved in drawing up these literally thousands of different individual policy decisions, and it would be quite inappropriate for me to have been so, even if I'd had the time in the day to be able to do it, which I probably didn't. We did, but the points that have been made here, several of these, the logic as to why these would bring families together is reasonably clear. The last of those, confining children in their cells, the logic of that position is much less clear if a way can be found for them to be out of their cells but without meeting others who they could transmit to. So I think it's really asking the question, was there at least an epidemiologic of any sort? And the answer to the previous ones was probably yes, probably on the last one, less so.
All right, we'll come back and look at those. I just want to finish the letter before going to the principal points that I think she's making. She sets out on page 2, and we can see it at the second paragraph, that she was aware that none of those decisions fell directly under Sir Patrick Valance's responsibility, but her concern was that they all stemmed from the same thing, which was the public health guidance that was principally aimed at adults having these sorts of more profound consequences potentially for children. And then she went on to ask the 3 bullet points, and I think it's important that we just look at them. So what consideration SAGE had given in producing its advice to the different susceptibility of children to COVID-19, whether SAGE had explored the potential for differential social distancing requirements, and whether SAGE advice recommended treating children in the same way as adults in terms of social distancing requirements, and if so, what the reasons for this were. So I think if we took a really practical example from the scenarios she had put before you, if you take children being required to self-isolate for 14 days, when they were admitted to a children's home or an inpatient mental health hospital, I think there she's saying, is that really necessary as a matter of epidemiology in order to protect those children?
Well, let's just take that one, because I think it is in a sense, the challenge is a fair one, and I want to be clear that SAGE was giving pretty high-level advice, which policymakers were then interpreting as best they could in multiple different environments. But much of some of your previous modules of this inquiry have been about the risks that came from people going into a health environment without having a period of isolation, and those points were made incredibly powerfully. Here, the opposite point is being put. In a sense, you can't have it both ways. This is a situation where if you bring someone who is potentially infected into a closed environment, there is going to be a significant risk to everybody else in that closed environment. That's a reality. Now, you could say, if they're all children, well, that doesn't matter because they're not going to come to any harm, and let them become infected. You could make that case, but that's the case. That isn't in a sense directly the case she's making, and I think there are risks to that argument. And there, were children who had not been infected to come to harm, or indeed staff in these environments, because remembering they're closed environments, come to harm, probably higher probability of that. As a result of that, I think people would feel that was quite a serious thing to have happened. So I think, as with so much of COVID, you were forced into a choice of 2 terribly bad options. And the decision at this point, at the very high point of the pandemic, as it still was at the high point of the pandemic, although going down by now, was that the risk of the transmission was greater. As we got into a much lower period, July, August time, the risk-benefit actually shifted, not because the individual risks were different, but because the probability of someone being infected, for example, was going to be smaller. So there were changes over time.
I think what the Children's Commissioner is raising, and it's appreciated that it may not have been an issue for SAGE to resolve if this is really just about the policies that were being applied. But if you took, for example, the isolation of a child going into a psychiatric inpatient clinic, the suffering that might cause to a child is potentially quite extreme, coupled with, for example, their inability to see their family. And I think I think she's raising is whether or not the rules needed to be quite so blunt, potentially, in those situations where you're dealing with potentially vulnerable children. It may be possible to have blunt rules for everybody else, but whether or not when it comes to the specific vulnerabilities of children, the rules couldn't be slightly more nuanced, or there wasn't a different risk assessment to be made in that situation.
I think, and everybody would give primacy to the needs of children, so I think I want to make that as a first point. But because I was present, hearing some of these debates played out, although I wasn't actually the person who was making the decision on them, what I was aware was that virtually every single group said that they were a special case for whom there should be a carve-out. So you had to have a good logic as to why a particular group it was reasonable to do that. Now, I think there is an argument, which is the reason we wanted to engage with this very seriously, for saying children are a group apart. But even within children, there are multiple different subgroups based on age and based on a number of different areas. And as always, it's the edge cases that cause problems in policy terms. So the starting point has to be the rules start the same for everyone. Then you say, okay, is there a way in which we can make them easier for children as a group? And then there are some specific groups of children who are particularly vulnerable for whom we can make a particular carve-out. But that was the way in which the policy makers were trying to work. SAGE couldn't really particularly help them with that because we wouldn't have, for example, to take the example she was giving, data that would help us to work out whether in a particular mental health institution there would be an increased risk. For example, the children who are at some of the children who are at most risk of COVID were people who had neurodevelopmental issues, some of whom overlap with areas of mental health, most don't. But there are a whole series of sub-questions, and as soon as you look at them, what you start to see is that these are quite complicated questions which individuals are having to answer. And we don't know the level of disability, the level of other risk factors that would be in these institutions we're talking about. So I just think it is very easy always to make a reason for each individual exception. And then when you look at the totality of all the exceptions you've made, and this is a problem we had all the way through COVID, actually, you find out that you've actually undone all the good of the really difficult social interventions like closing schools that have been achieved previously.
But is there not, and I appreciate this is specific to COVID-19, but was it not really important that the clear difference here was that most children wouldn't become seriously ill with COVID? Of course, appreciating there were exceptions, but for the most part, they wouldn't, and that did provide a good policy basis, potentially, for differentiating the position of children.
So here I think what we have to differentiate on a high level, back to a much earlier discussion we had, is there are broadly two groups of things that were being done by elected leaders. One group of things were which had an effect on children directly. One group of things were for the benefit of children narrowly, individually, and if the intervention that was being talked about was to protect a particular child, then you could actually start from the principle of actually this is a pretty low risk infection relative to other risks they've got, not zero risk, to be clear.
Yes.
There were very, some children came to significant harm, small numbers, but tragic ones in each case, and in aggregate, not necessarily even small. But these kind of interventions were not designed to try and protect individual children. They were designed to try and pull down the overall rate of infection for the whole of society, from which you have to start off with some broad principles, and then there will be a necessity for some carve-outs. And the examples of children who were vulnerable going to school was an obvious carve-out that was made at an early stage. But there's only so far you can go before either you get policy incoherence, or you actually start undermining the whole policy aim that you were trying to achieve in the first place, and undoing all the good of the sacrifices that has been made by these really hard social interventions, including their effects on children in the round.
Yeah, I'm going to look at the reply that you sent and then ask you, I think, about the two principled issues that arose out of this correspondence. The reply is at INQ 000 239 696. So I think, and this is the letter that both you and Sir Patrick Vallon sent in reply. So I think you set out at the first paragraph, and we can pick it up from the third line down. We have sought to differentiate between the effects on children and adults, and pointing to the Children's Task and Finish working group. Yes.
That's correct. And there was a very distinguished group of people looking at just specifically issues of childhood, which was active, and you've seen some of the outputs from what they did, which I thought were very thoughtful and well evidenced for the point in time that they were written.
And then at the second paragraph, in response to her question, what consideration SAGE has given in producing its advice to the differential susceptibility of children to COVID. And I think here you're confirming that younger children might be less susceptible to infection.
Yes. And we put a bit more of a confidence around that statement.
But that there wasn't sufficient evidence to be clear about that in respect of children aged 14 to 18.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct. And that remained the case for quite a long time.
And then at the third paragraph down, that the indirect effects, picking this up from the second line, the indirect effects of reopening schools, regardless of which option is taken, is likely to have a greater impact on transmission than schools themselves. So is that something that had emerged more clearly at that point, that it was the indirect effects rather than the direct effects?
That was a supposition at this point in time. There wasn't good evidence to support that.
And then turning to the next page, whether SAGE had explored the potential for different social distancing requirements. You explained that hadn't been considered by SAGE.
Yes, I think with the exceptions of the things where we could actually make a differentiation, where schooling was the obvious one, we didn't think there was sufficient data to provide a scientific answer. The policy questions are important policy questions, but what we weren't able to do, one way or the other, was say there's a strong scientific rationale for one position or another position.
And to her third point, whether SAGE advice recommends treating children in the same way as adults in terms of social distancing, and what the reasons for this are, you explained that SAGE hadn't given specific advice as to whether children should be treated differently in terms of social distancing requirements. However, when it came to schools, it had been assumed that social distancing wouldn't be in place, correct?
Yes, although I think the age of the children here is really important. So, I think it's difficult to see a situation where, for example, young primary school children would really be able to maintain social distancing in any meaningful way in the way that adults are able to. If you're talking about older young people in their sort of 15, 16, 17, you could see a way in which they might be able to do it. Whether they would choose to is a secondary question, but you can actually see a way in which that could happen. So this is, in a sense, my point about it's important not to lump all children together. Children are in very different positions, both in terms of their risk on their epidemiology and in terms of what they can and cannot do.
So can I go back then to the two principled issues I think the Children's Commissioner was raising? I think the first one was that she was asking whether or not the advice being commissioned by SAGE was sufficiently asking the question whether children could be treated differently. So that's a question of commissioning advice and asking the question, can children be treated differently? Can I ask them, could could more advice have been commissioned towards that end?
Well, I think let's separate out two separate things. SAGE was in part a self-commissioning body, and that's why we had the Children and Young People's and Schools Task and Finish group, and then there were subgroups of that actually, and they would be looking off their own bat at areas where they thought the science was helping us to understand issues specifically on children and young people, and if they identified them, they would then flag them to SAGE so that we could pass them on if we agreed with their analysis, and there was no point that I can recall we didn't agree with their analysis. We thought their analysis was sound. So that was one route by which SAGE could do it itself. But very large amounts of what SAGE did, and properly, was in response to policy questions. So if Cabinet Office, if Department of Education, if Ministry of Local Government had said, can you tell us, we would like to differentiate children or children of different ages from one another, or children from adults, what will that do? Then the modelers, the social scientists, or SAGE more widely, would respond to that area. But I think a misapprehension that quite a lot of people had all the way through the pandemic was that SAGE's job was to devise and promulgate policy. That is not the case. SAGE's job was to provide scientific evidence, either for areas where, in a sense, we could see it coming out of the scientific literature, irrespective of the policy question, hence the children's subgroup, because they were up on that literature, or where we were commissioned by policymakers to ask the question, can we make a differentiation here in the case of children, for example? SAGE was not driving government policy, and that I think is an important differentiation, which, to be clear, the Children's Commissioner fully appreciates. She says that in the letter that she's writing to us.
So just again, if we take a really practical example, that of children having to self-isolate for 14 days when they go to hospital, for example, I suppose the question was there sufficient commissioning of advice to say, do we have to do this for children? Or is it your view that that question didn't even need to be asked because it was clear it had to be done in order for the policy to be effective?
Well, given the point I made about thousands of policy decisions being taken, an issue had to be a relatively high level one for it to be sent to SAGE. So to take that as an example, to had a situation where SAGE was trying to adjudicate on these thousands of policy decisions would have made no sense, because we'd have added no value. We had nothing, the level of modelling would in no way have allowed us to go to that point. Now, there were people who were, in a sense, intermediary between SAGE and some of the decision-making, which would include, for example, Public Health England, what then became UKHSA, and others, who might, on a more granular level, try and interpret it in a consistent way. But consistency was very important on this. And what you couldn't have is a set of decisions in one part of the policy sphere that looked completely incoherent from decisions that were taken in other areas. But I'm trying to narrow down to what SAGE could and could not do. SAGE was not there to police every single individual policy decision, nor would it have been able to, and it would have been inappropriate use of its skills, which were not in that area.
Now, to be clear, Professor Whitty, I think that's the direction of the questions. It's trying to understand where, if you have these quite broad, blunt policy tools intended to reduce transmission, where does the question of whether they can be applied in a more nuanced way to children come in? Is it at the SAGE level, or is it somewhere below that?
It's much below that. But I think SAGE's position throughout, and you can see that from the Children's and Young People's Task and Finish group, was that children were likely to be particularly badly affected by the social measures, not just schooling, but others, and that therefore, where a possibility was available, I suppose our broad answer would be yes, we should prioritise the needs of children. So very much in line, really, with what the Children's Commissioner was saying to that extent. But what we weren't able to do was then go down several levels down to these individual policy components.
And might that then be a question of ensuring that when it comes to the promulgation of policy in these areas, that decision makers are provided with enough latitude, I suppose, to potentially recognise that in certain situations children might need to be treated in a different way?
Yes, but I mean, this is straying beyond
I understand.
the SAGE point, but I would go back to this point about consistency. And it was very important across government for reasons of fairness that people didn't have sufficient latitude, that actually one area of policy would be incredibly liberal and another would be incredibly strict just because people had chosen to use their own initiative. There has to be some degree of uniformity across government, or actually issues of unfairness start to arise. And as I mean, since it's an obvious point, but it's come across in multiple previous bits of the inquiry, the quickest way to undermine public confidence in measures is for them to be seen to be unfair. So fairness is important. And if you're going to differentiate, you've got to be able to explain the logic and explain why it's not the same as another policy area.
I'm grateful. I think the second principal point that's potentially raised by the Commissioner's letter is, where do the societal impacts on children come into decision making? So on the one hand, I think she is asking about scientific advice and whether it's specifically differentiated the position of children. And the second question is, if these sorts of decisions are going to have potentially disproportionate impacts on children, where does that factor in? And I think the question is, does that come in at the SAGE stage? Is it for SAGE to provide that perspective, or does it come at a different point in the decision making?
So let us say SAGE had been able to say, which unfortunately we were not able to, but it would have been a good position to be in, primary school children under the age of 11, for the sake of argument, do not transmit this virus, nor do they come to major harm. Then it would have been possible, essentially, for practical purposes, to exclude primary school children from all interventions. That would have been a very good outcome. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do that, but that's the kind of thing where SAGE advice would be useful, is where we can make a kind of quite broad statement that actually takes a group of the population out of the equation altogether, or says it's very significantly so significantly lower risk that actually it is reasonable to make different decisions on that basis. And actually, when it came to reopening schools, I think the point about primary schools being probably a lower risk than secondary schools was an important point for SAGE to make. That wasn't a narrow point, that was quite a broad point. But it's the breadth of the point, I think, and is it based on science rather than on supposition,
yes,
that makes it a SAGE issue.
All right, but in terms of, I mean, there was no decision that was that clear-cut during the pandemic, and there probably never will be. There'll be far more nuanced assessments of risk. When it comes to those very broad points about, for example, if you close schools, the sort of panoply of effects that it will have on children and the need to balance that or weigh that in the balance, is that a matter for SAGE, or is that something that belongs in the realm of the policy makers or the decision makers?
Where a significant driver of the decision is or could be based on scientific evidence, then absolutely. And that's most important actually when the science is counterintuitive. So if the science lines up with common sense, it actually probably makes rather less difference. But where, as sometimes happens, the scientific output is not intuitive to people, and actually, for example, the effect of exponential rises in infections is not intuitive to people, then the science tends to be very powerful.
I'm being asked if you can slow down slightly,
Sorry.
Professor Whitty. And again, I'm just staying on this broad issue of where children's interests come into play to ask you about the rule of 6, which is obviously put forward as a paradigm as to when a different decision could have been made that would have favoured the interests of children but wasn't. But that in other parts of the United Kingdom, children were excluded from the rule of 6. So can I ask you about that from a scientific or SAGE perspective, why children were included in that rule in England?
Well, I think I'd go back a step, which is there was a prior debate about whether the correct, let's start to go back even further than that. The aim of this was actually a liberalising aim. So prior to this, families would not have been able to meet at all. So the first point is the aim of this was actually to allow family members and friends and others to meet who previously would not have been able to. So this is a liberalising rather than a restricting issue. But the advice from SAGE was that the key unit, and I've said this several times, is the family, or at least the household, not necessarily the family, but the household. So the assumption being that once an infection was in one person in a household, it was likely to transmit within that household. So now the reason I make that point is it would have, for example, been arguably at least as good and probably better epidemiologically to have allowed 3 households to join together, irrespective of size, than to have 6 individuals who might be from 2 households or might be from 6 households joining together. And that was debated quite extensively within, and we made those points reasonably clearly, and that was a SAGE point. Then the way it was turned into the policy of the rule of 6 was essentially a policy decision that, for a variety of reasons, the government felt it was preferable, the government meaning the wider government, felt it was preferable to have the rule of 6 model than one which was a smaller number, but a household-based one. And that was based on a number of factors, including actually enforceability, that it is, the police can at the end of the day count 6 people, whereas if you see 15 people together and you say, are you 3 households, and someone says yes, it's very difficult to tell that one way or the other. But there were also wider issues, I think, in terms of why they went down that path. But they were not science-based reasons. The science-based point was the smaller the number of households meeting together to achieve the policy aim, which is to allow people to have some social interaction, to meet and to have the benefits of that, it could have been achieved by another route. Now, your question is a slightly more specific one, which is, would it have been possible to have had the rule of 6 model that we had in England with children excluded? And the answer to that is yes, although it would probably have led to a higher level of transmission than if children were not excluded. And the question is, where does the risk benefit then lie? But children are not, as is sometimes implied, magically a group who are never infected and never infect others. They are part of the infection group. They differ by age band, and it would be possible to say, for example, that young children have a lower probability of contributing to the effect than others. So you could have said, as happened in Wales, I think, children under 11 don't count for the purposes of this, and there is a logic to that. It doesn't mean you won't have some upward pressure on transmission. You will, and therefore, as a result of that, there are other things you can't do. Because what we were trying to do at the point that the Rule of 6 was brought in was we accepted we were on a knife edge, and everything we did that was liberalising meant we could not do something else that was liberalising, because otherwise the R would have increased. So the decision that Wales took was a perfectly reasonable decision, but it came at some level of cost in terms of potential transmission.
But isn't that is just a question, isn't it, of weighing your risks and recognising that because it was having such an impact on them, that this is something that could be done that actually might have a real benefit for children, and that the cost, I mean, as you say, it may have come at some cost, but it was a cost that could be borne.
I mean, if I'd been a policymaker, I would have argued for having, let's say, 3 households able to meet, or your number, I'm making the number up, rather than 6 individuals. But I wasn't a policymaker. I was, in a sense, making the scientific point, and then it was for policy people to try and interpret that.
But I think if we're, again, just understanding it from the science perspective, can we take from what you've just said that there was no particular imperative to have children within the rule, that there was an alternative, that could have been an alternative course available that might have meant that children could have more socialising?
Yes, but you then have to accept that you were probably going to have to not do something else you wanted to do. So there was as this went on, we developed the concept of essentially a total tariff of things you needed to do, and the more you do in one area, the less you'll be able to do in another area. And it was the choice for policymakers, this classic policymaking, to choose between these options, all of which, of course, were bad options, but to decide which was the one which had the least social disbenefit for the same amount of impact on the pandemic.
All right, so a decision for the policy realm as opposed to the scientific.
Yes, although the scientific realm can help to say these are the things that will have an impact, and then the policymakers have to make a choice as to which is the bundle of things at this point in time which they think is socially the right one to go for within that kind of tariff.
Professor Whitty, I'm going to move on, if I may, to the decision to reopen schools and to some of the evidence that was given by Sir John Coles, to which you've responded with your 10th witness statement. And I think it's probably best if I just say what Sir John Coles said so that it's accurate rather than trying to summarise. He said, now, it wasn't until August that Chris Whitty said there is more harm, there will be more harm to children from not attending school in September than ever would be from contracting the virus. Now, he said that in August. Of course, that was also true in March, and we knew it to be true in March, but it doesn't mean that it was the wrong decision. You know, I'm sure this is something the inquiry will be looking at extremely carefully. I don't know whether it was the right decision or not to close schools in March, but I understand why that was the decision. But I don't think it should have taken until August for Chris Whitty, the health side and the education side, to be saying in very clear and loud terms to the whole country, look, the reason we're closing schools is not because children are at risk. Children are not at risk. We're closing schools in order to protect the wider population, at-risk people, the elderly, and to avoid damage to the NHS. That was his evidence. You've set out in your 10th statement some of the statements that you made from March 2020. I'm just going to summarise. You said in March 2020 that children have a milder disease, but that the risk shouldn't be trivialised. You said in April that the great majority of children either don't get COVID or the symptoms are minor.
Yes, I went on to say more than that, actually. Are you carrying on, or shall I?
No, I was just trying to put the headlines of some of the things you had
yes,
said.
That was true, and that we said that repeatedly.
And that you were lacking evidence about the role that children played in driving transmission at that point as well. And in May, you said that the risk to children is very, very low, and that the reopening of primary schools wouldn't lead to an upswing in R if it was done very carefully. And I think you pointed out.
All of those are correct, but there's an additional point which I made, which I think is relevant to what Sir John said. And I have to say, in a sense, I agree with his general point, but he just factually wasn't correct in what I'd said, which is, I said in several of the things I sent you, and there were many others, I just chose those, also said extensively, actually, when giving evidence to the Select Committee in Parliament. I know you don't take those into account, but it was quite a lot of evidence on this point, that as a result of this, I said there were two possible reasons why you might close schools. One was for protection of children, and that was not the reason we were doing this, and I've said that repeatedly through February, March, April, and indeed beyond that. The alternative and additional reason was because of the impact on the pandemic as a whole, and that were schools to close, because at the point I was saying this, it was a were schools to close stage. The reason would be because of the effect on the pandemic, not because schools were a particular risk to children. Now, I said that for three reasons. Firstly, that was what Sage was saying. Secondly, because it was clearly true but needed to be said. And the third was, while schools were open before they closed, it was important parents didn't think that there was a big risk to their children for children being in school at that point in the pandemic. And also I could see forward to when we were trying to reopen schools if they had to close, and it was important to lay down in public that was the situation, that the schools have not been closed for the protection of children, they've been closed because of the effect on the epidemic. So in a sense we made that point, or I made that point, many others did, but I made that point repeatedly over that period, but for that reason. So I agree with the broad point, I just wanted to clarify the record.
Yes, I mean, I think Sir John's point was, I think it was twofold. The first was he felt that there was a sort of void in the public argument prior to the opening of schools, and that government wasn't filling it in terms of putting forward the positive case why schools could reopen. So I think that was his first point, and therefore it was falling to people like him to try and address it. And then I think the second point that he was reflecting, Professor Whitty, was that obviously the provision of this consensus statement by you and the other chief medical officers of the United Kingdom was very important, but it came at quite a late stage.
Yes, I think, in a sense, I agree with all of Sir John's points. The only reason I responded to this was he made a thing of singling me out and saying I'd not said anything about this, which was factually incorrect. And that was the reason I put those out. But I also think it is worth making the point that the issue of schools being not the reason for closing schools is not for the protection of the children. It was very important that point was made honestly and up front all the way through the pandemic, and it was. I gave you just the examples I gave, and many other people, Jenny Harries, for example, said very similar things in other environments. So this point was being made repeatedly. Sir John may not have heard them, that's fine. But actually the health side, as he puts it, were making these points all the way through. We were very consistent on our advice on this one.
All right, but can I just ask that it is correct that the consensus statement didn't come out until the 23rd of August, which is obviously just very shortly before schools reopened. Why was it late? Because it was responsive to the fact there were voices arguing against the closure of schools, rather than it being a positive, optimistic case as to why schools could reopen?
Well, parents will be very relieved by the fact that I very rarely write to parents. This was an exception to that. And the reason for that was that inevitably, my view and the view of all the other CMOs was that children had been out of school for a while, parents would be understandably nervous. Also, teachers and other school staff were nervous, and there were some voices, including some quite loud voices in the scientific community, who were arguing that schools should not open. Indeed, the British Medical Association argued that, various other bodies did as well, slightly to my surprise. And so my view was, firstly, the time to write to parents was when they were thinking of sending their children to school, rather than in the middle of a lockdown when schools were not being reopened anyway. That didn't seem to me a terribly helpful thing to do one way or the other. And secondly, because I did want to make sure that parents and school staff had, as best we could, a fair laying out of the evidence. So it wasn't a simple, send your children to school, it's absolutely fine, it's great for them. It was a much more careful laying out of what we understood to be the science at this point in time. And that was because this was the stage at which parents would be making their decisions about whether to send their children to school or not, in terms of their own at least desire to do so. So our view was this was the point to lay this out in detail. But I do want to re-stress this was not, none of the points we made in the letter were new in the sense they'd all been put into the public domain at some point along the last previous months. What was new was just bringing them together in one form that we hope to be useful to parents, pupils and school staff, including teachers.
And maybe if we just pick that up from your witness statement, please, at INQ 000588-064, page 34. I'm just going to jump straight to some of the points that may be important, Professor Whitty. But if we look at this and count, I think it's about 5 paragraphs down, evidence. So transmission of COVID-19 to children in schools does occur, but on current evidence, it's probably not a common route of transmission, and it may be lower in primary age children than secondary age. And then skipping one, and we'll pick this up again. This is the advice about shielding. So by this point being set out here, based on our better understanding of COVID-19, the great majority have now been advised that they do not need to do so again and that they should return to school. A small number of children under paediatric care have been or will be given individual advice about that. And again, if we just go over the page, setting out as well the position of teachers and other school staff as well. And I think if we look at the second paragraph, setting out that transmission of COVID-19 to staff members in school does occur, but that it may largely be staff to staff rather than from children. Is that correct?
Yes.
And if we go over the page, please. And the first paragraph, because schools connect households, it's likely opening schools will put some upward pressure on transmission more widely and therefore increase R. But making the point, and I think this had been said publicly before, that schools were much less important in the transmission of COVID-19 than it was the position in respect of flu.
Yes.
And then a couple of paragraphs down, opening schools may be as important in linking households indirectly, for example, by allowing parents to go back to work or meeting at the school gates or on public transport. Thank you, that can come down. So again, I think, is that a reflection of the lack, or I suppose that it was the lack of clear evidence that it was school closures of themselves that were important as opposed to all of these indirect impacts?
Yes, and I hope, because you've seen all the other documents around that, you would agree that that was an accurate reflection of what the scientific evidence that was being given inside government was at the time. So it was trying to be open with the public about exactly where we were.
And obviously that advice brings up the position of children who had been shielding before that point, or who were in families who had been shielding. And I think that in evidence that you've given previously, I think you reflected that shielding was a voluntary act and that some people would continue sensibly to continue shielding after this point. But the advice at that point obviously put children in a different position because it wasn't voluntary. They had to go back to school unless they fell within that narrow band of children who were particularly immunosuppressed or had very specific reasons. So can I just ask you a little bit about that and the rationale for that, given that children didn't have a choice, they had to go back to school?
Well, I think that the key thing about shielding for adults, and I'll come on to children, but I think since that's the comparison, is that over time our understanding about the who was at risk from an adult point of view improved, but we still were of the view that there were a group of people who were significantly increased risk. And the reason that we felt that stopping shielding in the middle of 2020 was possible was because they had a very low risk because there was very little virus, because of all the work that people had done in the community to date, including the closing of schools. So the rates were incredibly low, if you recall, which I'm sure you do very clearly. The transmission in the middle of the year, it was very low. Number in hospital with COVID was relatively at a very, very low level. So the reason that we felt adults could stop shielding was not because we had a different view of their risk. We still thought they had a high risk, but because the epidemiology had changed. The situation in children was quite a different one, which was at the very beginning, and I was involved indirectly in this because it was the Office of CMO which did this. We had a list of conditions we thought children might be at particularly high risk of coming to serious harm. And as time went by, it became clear that two things, actually. The first was the harm that we thought these groups might have didn't in fact materialise, whereas it did for adults, although exactly who in adults changed. But with children, the risk was substantially lower than we initially thought it might be for these high-risk groups. And the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, who are experts in this area, kindly looked at this area and essentially said the great majority of these children are at trivially increased risk relative to all other children. That's not to say that some children don't come to harm, but for example, having asthma is not a reason why a child is likely to come to particular harm. At the same time, the low point in the epidemic, which was there in August and September, was also true for children as well as adults. But the difference between these was with adults that there was still an increased risk. Whereas our judgment now was that for children, we did not see this increased risk, with the exception of some very, very narrowly defined and